In case you didn't know, it's a mandatory requirement to tell everyone you meet about trams in order to be a true Melburnian. Because of this, today we're going to look at one of the most important milestones of the tram network's history. Trams in Victoria began as horse-drawn vehicles. The first one to operate was a short route from Fairfield Station to Thornbury, which opened in 1884. Just 1 year later, the first cable trams began running from Burke Street to Bridge Road in Richmond, right next to the Yarra River. At the same time as this was happening, there was a lot of interest worldwide in using a new technology for urban transport. With significant progress being made throughout the 19th century, electricity rapidly became used in everyday life. We've touched on this topic in my previous video about battery electric trams, which you can see via the link here in the top right hand corner. In Melbourne, news of how other countries were finding uses for electricity spread rapidly and sparked great excitement. The world's first operational electric tram opened in 1875 in Systrayetsk in Russia, and the first in Britain opened in Brighton in 1883. This huge interest came to a head when Melbourne held the Centennial Exhibition in 1888, an event to celebrate a century since the first official European settlement of Australia. One of the most popular exhibits here was organised by the Thomson Houston Electric Company from the United States. It demonstrated an electric tram along a 274 metre long track through Carlton Gardens. The initial fare was set at 1 penny, but the exhibition's organisers insisted on tripling it to threepence and taking a 50% cut of the income. Despite the price, the exhibit impressed locals so much that it won several prizes at the show and became the inspiration for Melbourne's very first electric tram. When the exhibition closed in March 1889, a coalition of businessmen and landowners in the eastern outskirts of Melbourne purchased the leftover equipment and demonstration tram. This organisation was called the Box Hill and Doncaster Tramway Company Limited. It was formed in October 1888 to build a tram line between these two rural towns. They had initially drawn up plans for a horse-drawn system, but when they heard about the opportunity presented by the exhibition, they decided to use electricity instead, both for the significant operational cost savings, but also probably for the novelty factor to attract more passengers. The second point is important because, like many infrastructure projects at the time, it was mainly a speculative venture. Box Hill had only just become a town of a noticeable size, and Doncaster was little more than a collection of buildings on top of a hill surrounded by farms and bushland. Also, like many infrastructure projects of the period, many members of the tramway company had property interests near the route of the proposed tram, which, if constructed, would undoubtedly boost their value. This included the chairman of the company, William Meader, who owned the Tower Hotel at Doncaster Hill and had many other property and hotel interests across the city. The Box Hill and Doncaster Tramway Company rapidly got to work with their new tram and equipment. They had already secured the rights to run the tram down Station Street, which was then a private road, directly between the centre of Box Hill and all the way up the top of Doncaster Hill. The idea was that people would arrive from Melbourne at Box Hill Station on the newly built railway, and then change to the tram to take them towards Doncaster. The company hoped to attract regular travellers, but also day trippers and tourists. Construction was very quick, with the 3.6 kilometres of track and associated infrastructure being finished in just a year since the company was incorporated. It officially opened on the 14th of October 1889 in a well-attended and elaborate ceremony. The technology installed for the tram was surprisingly similar to what we use today. An engine house was built about halfway along the line at Bushy Creek, and this supplied electricity to overhead copper wires, which then powered the tram. After it opened, initially the line was very successful. The Beaconsfield Tower, also known as Doncaster Tower, which was built in 1879 as an observation point, had become a popular tourist attraction. The tram made it much easier and more pleasant to get there, avoiding an uncomfortable and slow trip by horse along muddy country roads from Kew. Day trips to Doncaster were widely promoted, with posters proclaiming, quote, "the highest point within the same radius of Melbourne. Magnificent views across leagues of varied scenery, orchard landscapes, grassy slopes, forest scenery, mossy banks, and all the luxuriant foliage of Victoria." Many answered this call, and the tramway turned a healthy profit as a result. The tram itself could carry 40 passengers and travelled at an average speed of 14 kilometres per hour. This relatively slow speed was partially due to the tram's low power, but the topography of the area didn't help either. Both Box Hill and Doncaster are on top of steep hills, with these features forcing a significant 1 in 16 gradient of the tracks. But this was just the beginning of the company's problems. These steep grades quickly took their toll on the fairly primitive vehicle, and it broke down very frequently. The company then found itself embroiled in disputes over its service and use of some private property along the route, and was forced to temporarily close or truncate its services at several points in the years that followed. Demand proved to be so high, though, that the company purchased a second tram from the United States. It arrived in 1890, which was more powerful and also featured a more comfortable enclosed cabin. It was hoped that this would turn the line's fortunes around, but unfortunately this was not to be the case. In 1891, the company was successfully sued for over £500 over unpaid wages. Already in dire financial straits due to declining revenue and the previous disputes, the tramway company went into voluntary administration. While the tram did continue to operate under administrators for a few months, another dispute soon arose. One of the owners of the land where the tram tracks were laid, the South Doncaster Estate Company, had had enough of its arguments with the tramway company. Exasperated, its board threatened to blow up the section of track built on its land if its conditions were not met. This forced the tram to stop operating, and the estate company even built a fence and trench around the tramway to prevent its use. This sparked a kind of revolt amongst the good burghers of Box Hill and Doncaster. Upon hearing the news of the South Doncaster Estate Company's threats, a group of local residents went and destroyed the fence and filled in the trench. In response, the estate company cut down the poles that held the overhead tram wires, which then prompted a crowd of over 600 protesters to burn an effigy of the estate company's secretary, Alfred Tankard, hung on the tram wire at the Doncaster terminus. Eventually, an agreement was reached to allow trams to continue running over the estate company's land, which, by the sound of it, probably prevented some kind of local revolution to save the tramway. The next year, in 1892, new owners took over the company. Led by Richard Serple and Matthew Glassford, they got to work making changes and improvements, such as upgrading the infrastructure to make the track less steep. They also had plans to extend the tramway along Williamson's Road and then all the way to the intersection of Heidelberg and Templestowe Roads in present-day Bulleen, as well as carrying non-passenger traffic for local industries, such as livestock and goods. Things looked like they were finally settling down for the trouble-plagued tramway, and passenger traffic steadily increased. Unfortunately though, the depression and land boom bubble burst in 1893 spelled the beginning of the end. By 1894, the company had exhausted almost all of its funds and was forced into an arrangement with its manager Henry Hilton. He continued to operate the tram on a lease with the company for just £1 per week. This was hardly a long-term solution, and Hilton was finally forced to close the tramway for the last time on the 6th of January 1896. Very little trace of this historic tramway survives today. After it was closed down, the rails were sold to a timber sawmill in the Otway Ranges, the boilers to Robinson Brothers and Company in South Melbourne, and the trams themselves sent to the Sunshine Harvester Works to be used in factories, bought by Hugh Victor Mackay. Today, this section of Station Street is called Tram Road, and the laneway behind the former post office is named Hilton's Lane, after Henry Hilton himself. Some interpretive history pieces have also been installed in a couple of places along the route. These include this art piece in the shape of a tram at the site of the former engine house, this plaque at the former tram terminus at Box Hill on the corner of Tram Road and Whitehorse Road, reinstated in 1989 after the original memorial was destroyed by a car in 1988, and a replica of one of the trams at Tram's Cottage, maintained by the Doncaster Templestowe Historical Society. On a side note, what is somewhat less known about the 1888 exhibition is that it did a lot more than just trigger the construction of this particular tramway. During proceedings, representatives from many other councils and bodies that were operating or interested in operating trams in Melbourne came along to inspect the electric tramway exhibit. Many were very impressed and became keen to be the first to adopt this new technology. Among those to announce their rollout as the result of their visit were Coburg, Footscray and Essendon councils. The colourful history of the Box Hill to Doncaster tramway, while short-lived, nevertheless proved that the electric tram could work in Melbourne. This helped set the stage for the future electrification of many of the city's tram lines using the overhead wire technology that was almost ahead of its time. Thanks for watching. If you enjoyed it and would like to see more, please subscribe to my channel so that you can stay up to date on future videos. Also feel free to visit my website at philipmallis.com. Thanks again, and I'll see you next time.